Welcome to FGCU Writing Center's presentation on MLA format. MLA format is a citation style. It tells us a lot of things, but here are the big things that most people think about and most people struggle with when working with MLA. It tells us how we format our paper, and it tells us how we indicate that we're using someone else's intellectual property, their ideas, their thoughts, their words, etc. And you need to indicate that you're using their intellectual property both in text, so when you're in your actual writing and you're using their property, and you also need to indicate it in a works cited, which is where you give all the bibliographic information for a source. And I really want to emphasize today that when using any kind of style guide, it's very, very important that you have some form of guide, some sort of reference for yourself, because there's lots of rules and it's really easy to get it wrong. And I think talking about the general format of a paper in MLA is a good way for you to see why you need a guide. So here is an example of a first page of an MLA document. And just looking at it, you can see there's a lot of particular things. So the format for just the very first page of an MLA document, you'll see that you have a heading, which is in the upper left-hand corner, and it's your name, your instructor's name, course number, and date. Sometimes your instructor might ask for different information. In all citation styles, assignment guidelines, or in some cases the particularities of, let's say, a market, so a magazine, if you're trying to get published in there or something, they're going to trump whatever rules of MLA or APA or anything like that. But this is your standard MLA first page. And then you also had the title in the middle of the page, and it wasn't bolded, it wasn't italicized, it wasn't underlined, it was just regular words, unless one of those words would otherwise be italicized. Example of that would be a title of a book. And if we look back here, you'll see Blood Meridian, that's a book, so it's italicized, but you'll see the name, professor's name, class, date, etc. Okay. And that was just for the format for the first page. Format for all the pages, you have 1-inch margins on all sides, so sometimes you have to change that in your word processor. Times New Roman 12-point font is recommended. Sometimes you can get away with using a different, very readable font, but Times New Roman is very recommended. Don't do something crazy. The whole document's double-spaced, even headings, things like that. Then you have a page header, which is not to be confused with the heading. Page header is in the header of the document, and in this case, it's on every single page. It's in the upper right-hand corner. It's a ½ inch from the top in case, for whatever reason, you can't just click into the header and start writing in it. And you have the last name followed by the page number, and we'll look at that again real quick too. There you go. That'd be up here. Okay. So you can see there's a lot you can get wrong, which is why it's really important for you to have a guide. And if you need a guide, come see us at the Writing Center and we can provide you with one. We have lots of guides, lots of resources. If not, you can often look in a handbook and I'll have some information, or there's a lot of good guides online too, including on our webpage. All right. So that was just talking about the format. Now we're going to talk about the really, really important thing, in-text citations, when you use other people's intellectual property in your writing. And what I really want to emphasize here is that it's very important for you to stay organized and very important for you to know how to cite and when to cite, or else you could accidentally plagiarize, which is a big no-no. First, we should know what citing means, right? So to cite is to give people credit for their intellectual property, right? In MLA, that means you usually give the name of the author and the page number. That's normally how you cite things in text, but there are exceptions. So you cite whenever you take an author's actual words, right? That's called a quote. Most people know that, but sometimes they don't always know that if you paraphrase or summarize, which is when you take their ideas and their thoughts and you put them in your own words, you also have to cite. So you always cite when quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing when using another person's idea. And for whatever reason, if you're ever like, I'm not really sure, I don't really know, when in doubt, just cite, because it's easier to take away a citation than to sort of remember when you were debating whether or not to use a citation. So paraphrasing. So I already mentioned, it's when you restate things in your own words, but it's very important when you do this that you carefully reword using synonyms, and be careful when doing that. You don't want to just right-click and just sort of select a word. You want to select words that you really know the meaning of. And another way to do this is to change the actual structure of the sentence. So if you have a whole bunch of short sentences, you might combine them, right? If you have a long sentence, you might break it apart. If you have a sentence that introduces X idea and then Y idea, you might switch those things around. And that's just to really make sure that you don't inadvertently plagiarize, and paraphrasing is where it happens the most. So we have two examples there, and you'll see that in both occasions, the author's name and the page number is given. You'll see in both occasions the page number comes at the end of the sentence, but the author's name sometimes appears in the parenthetical citation at the end of the quote or at the end of the sentence, and sometimes it appears in the actual sentence. So that's up to you. That's your choice. If you want to say the writer's name in the actual sentence, then you don't have to put the author's name in the parenthetical at the end of the sentence. If you don't want to say the author's name in the actual sentence, you put all that information at the end of the sentence, and you'll notice that the punctuation, in this case a period, comes after the parenthetical citation. So sometimes students put it before. Don't do that. And you'll notice in both those occasions things were reworded, the structure was changed. So now I want to talk a bit about why you want to paraphrase. So first, you want to paraphrase sometimes because it prevents overquoting. When you overquote, you're really giving another person too much power in your paper. You're letting them speak for you. You're letting other people's words write your paper for you, and it can just really undermine your credibility. And it shows that you understand the ideas and can put them in your own words. So it helps you develop credibility. And as mentioned before, be careful that you make significant changes to the original. Not changes in meaning, you want to be accurate to their words, but changes in the structure, changes in the words. And if you don't do this, it's plagiarism, which is bad news. So the next thing we're going to talk about is direct quoting. So direct quoting is when you're using the exact words and you put quotation marks around them. So you have to put quotation marks around them, and you have to cite just like with paraphrasing, or else it's plagiarism. And whenever you do quote something, you should integrate those quotes, and that means a certain thing. Quote integration is when you provide a smooth transition from your words to the words in the source. So often we'll do this by giving some context for a source, by telling the reader something about the writer or the research. So it'll say something like, according to Dr. Jackson, the most eminent biologist in his field, right? So we give that information to the reader to let the reader know that this is a credible source. We've introduced the source too. And also when we quote, we want to use a thing called a signal phrase. And what this is a verb to indicate that we are quoting. For example, if we're using a source to show disagreement in the literature, we might say the writer disagrees and then give the quote. Or if we want to say that this is an objection, we would say the writer objects, or so on and so forth. And if you look online, you can find a whole bunch of lists, of big, huge lists of these, but those are just some examples on the right. Sometimes what I do is I write say or says or said, depending on the tense, every single time when I'm just drafting, and then I'll go back and use a better signal phrase. Boom. So in the quoting world, we have two different quotes. We have the brief quote, which is a quotation that's less than 4 typed double-spaced lines, and then we have a long quote. So in this case, we're going to talk first about the brief quote. So you want to introduce it using a signal phrase, and as was the case before, you have some freedom about whether or not you want to give the writer's name in the sentence or in the parenthetical. And as also was the case, we had to give the punctuation after the parenthetical citation. So sometimes you won't know the name of the author. That often happens when it's an internet source, for example, or if it's a newspaper source sometimes. So there's a lot of rules for that, and I just wanted to give you some examples of them. In this case, we didn't know the author's name, but we had the name of the article, so the name of the article takes the place of the author name. Long or block quotes are when you have more than 4 typed lines. So brief quotes, you just quote them as we've been talking about. When it's less than 4 lines, when it's more than 4 lines, what you do is called a block quote, and you introduce it still with the signal phrase, but in this case, you're going to end the sentence right before the quote with a colon, and that sentence needs to be a complete sentence. And then you're going to indent 10 spaces instead of using quotation marks, which is actually 2 tabs. And you're going to double space everything, and then you place the punctuation before the page number, the parenthetical citation. So it's kind of tricky. Here's an example. We have a complete sentence, we have a colon, then we have all of that indented, no quotation marks, we have the period, then we have the parenthetical citation. That's for if you have 4 more lines, and you want to use block quotes sparingly because you're taking up a lot of space. So if you're going to take that much space up, make sure that you're going to talk a whole bunch about those quotes. Sometimes students use them just to get more pages, which is bad. So why are quotes cool? Sometimes the exact words are really powerful, interesting. So you want to use that powerful, interesting phrase. Sometimes when analyzing the language of a source, you want to give the actual language. It just helps the reader. If you want to talk specifically about one word that this writer used, it doesn't really make sense to change that word. And sometimes the writer is really important for your work or is really helping your credibility. So sometimes if you're writing a whole research project on one person, you want to quote sometimes so we can hear that person. Or let's say I'm writing a paper about Shakespeare, on a Shakespeare play or something, and there's a really eminent, really important, really influential Shakespeare scholar. I might quote them, for example, to show that maybe my reading in some ways aligns with their reading, to sort of develop credibility for myself. So we talked about in-text citations, and now we need to talk about works cited. And the works cited is where you give all the bibliographic information for every work that you've used in your actual text. So the thing I want to emphasize here is that if you have an in-text citation from a source, you must have a bibliographic entry in your works cited for that source, and vice versa. You don't want to have sources in your works cited that you don't actually use in your paper. That is what sometimes students will do with when, for example, they need 10 sources or something and they only have 9. And you don't want to use someone's intellectual property in your paper and not give the works cited entry. So there's very particular rules for this. For the most part, you just need to consult a guide. It's what we all do. It's a pain in the butt, but here's an example of what it'll look like. You'll see works cited at the top, works. If you only have one work, it would be works cited, but we have more than one here. We have the last name and the page number in the right corner. And then you'll see something that's called a hanging indent. What a hanging indent is when everything after the first line of a paragraph, or in this case, a entry, is indented. You can look online for ways to do that, but how I like to do it is I like to have the ruler showing on Word, and I highlight the whole entry, or sometimes the whole page, and I will go up to, on the ruler, there's these two triangles, and one's pointing down and one's pointing up. And I take the one that's pointing up and I move it over 5 spaces, and that will move. That's the hanging indent, so everything after the first line. So the format, it's those I already just mentioned all that. And I didn't mention that the citations are listed alphabetically by either the author's last name or the first word of a title. Yeah, so here's a basic example. So you'll see we have writer's last name, comma, first name, then we have italicized title of the book. Then we have the place of publication, we have the publisher, which you'll see it's abbreviated in a certain way. In this case, that's University and Press, and guides will tell you all about that. Then we have the year of publication, then we have the type of publication. In the next example, we don't know the actual author's name, so we have the names of the work, the article, or something like that, and that's in quotation marks. Then we have the italicized title, then we have the year of publication, then we have the type of source, which is web, and then we have the access date. Again, very particular rules. All the punctuation there is important. You need a guide. Here's an example from a website, and you'll see in this case we have NP for no publisher. Sometimes it doesn't make it clear the sponsor of the site or the publisher of the site, so you have to indicate that you don't know that information. Alright, so when in doubt, check your textbook. Come see us at the Writing Center. You can consult the Purdue OWL website too, which is a really good resource that a lot of people like. Or you can just, look online. Sometimes you might run into a source that's not super credible, so you want to definitely check a bunch of them, but that's just part of being a learner, right? You have to evaluate your sources and evaluate the information you're using. But anyways, hope you learned about MLA. That's the end. Come see us in the Writing Center.